For years, she was labeled as not good enough, dismissed because of her past, and made to feel like she was nothing more than a gold digger. Her mother-in-law couldn't stop reminding her that she'd never fit in, simply because she grew up poor. Invitations to family events were hidden, whispers spread, and her worth was constantly questioned. But what no one saw coming was how she turned it all around. On her mother-in-law's 60th birthday, she gave a gift that no one could have predicted, and it changed everything. Stay tuned to find out how this quiet, strong woman turned the tables, shattered expectations, and proved just how wrong they all were. Before we get started, I'm curious, how did your family react when you achieved something they didn't expect? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that button now so you never miss an unforgettable story like this one. Avery Thomas was 29 years old when she married into the Monroes, a family that, by all accounts, radiated class, tradition, and money. She was smart, ambitious, and kind-hearted, but what she wasn't was rich. Avery had grown up in a cramped apartment in Detroit, raised by a single mom who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. She was the first in her family to graduate college, and while her degree was in business administration, her real education had come from life, scraping by, surviving, and never giving up. That resilience would be both her armor and her curse in the years to come. Her husband, Ryan Monroe, was a 32-year-old corporate lawyer from Boston. He'd grown up with tailored suits, summer homes, and dinner parties with CEOs. But he wasn't arrogant, at least not in the way one might expect. He loved Avery for her fire, for her ability to see the world from the ground up. He'd always told her she had a kind of wisdom money couldn't buy. Unfortunately, his mother, Margaret Monroe, didn't see things the same way. From the moment Avery met Margaret, she knew she was being evaluated, not just for her appearance or her manners, but for her origins. Margaret had the polished smile of a woman who had perfected passive aggression into an art. She was tall, poised, and had a presence that demanded attention. And from the beginning, she made it clear. Avery was an outsider. It began subtly. At first, Avery wasn't invited to small family dinners. Then it became larger things: cousin baby showers, birthdays, holiday gatherings. Every time, Margaret would have a convenient excuse. The invite must have gotten lost, or it was just immediate family, or we didn't think you'd be comfortable. Ryan always defended her, even confronting his mother multiple times. But Avery, not wanting to deepen the rift, would wave it off and pretend it didn't matter. But it did matter. What hurt most was hearing, through whispers from distant relatives or side glances at family reunions, that Margaret was telling everyone Avery was a gold digger, that she had married Ryan for his trust fund, that she didn't come from good stock. Avery, who had built herself from nothing, who worked 2 jobs while going to school, who launched her first failed business at 23 and her second at 25, was being painted as a parasite. Still, she stayed silent for years. Not because she was weak, but because she was planning. What Margaret didn't know was that Avery's second startup, a niche health tech platform focused on teletherapy, had taken off in a way no one expected. What started as a small project connecting underprivileged patients to affordable therapists exploded during the pandemic. Within 18 months, it had grown to a multi-million-dollar operation. Avery, who'd once struggled to afford rent, was now the CEO of one of the fastest-growing companies in her state. She kept it quiet, never bragged, never even corrected Margaret's assumptions. She didn't feel the need to prove herself to anyone. Not yet. But when Margaret's 60th birthday came around, everything changed. The party was extravagant, a black tie event hosted in a historical estate just outside of Boston. There were floral arrangements dripping from chandeliers, champagne fountains, and a guest list filled with society elites. Margaret wore a custom designer gown, basking in the attention like a queen in her court. Avery attended, of course, now used to blending in at events where her presence was silently questioned. But this time she had something different planned. As the evening drew to a close, and the orchestra softly played in the background, The MC announced that it was time for birthday speeches and gifts. Margaret was glowing as her eldest daughter presented her with a week-long trip to Paris. Another relative gifted her a diamond brooch. Laughter and polite applause filled the air. Then came Avery's turn. She stood up slowly, feeling dozens of eyes follow her. She held a small box in her hand. Modest, unassuming, Margaret looked amused. Inside the box wasn't jewelry or a trip or a designer handbag. It was a deed to a house in Margaret's name, fully paid off in cash. A beautiful cottage in Cape Cod. Margaret's lifelong dream, one she'd often spoken of but claimed was too impractical now. The room went silent as Margaret opened the envelope and read the documents. For the first time in Avery's memory, the woman was speechless. Then came the twist. "How did you afford this?" Margaret asked, her voice thin. "With the money I earned," Avery replied softly. "From the company you never asked about." Margaret's face paled. She looked around, realizing that every single person in that room now knew what Avery was capable of. All the whispers, all the judgments, all the lies collapsed in an instant, and Avery didn't gloat. She didn't smile smugly or revel in the moment. She simply sat down next to her husband, took his hand, and whispered, "Now she knows." But that was just the beginning. Because what no one at that party knew was that Avery's gift came with one condition, a secret buried in the fine print of the deed, a detail that would shake the Monroe family to its core and reveal a betrayal even deeper than Margaret's insults. Margaret didn't sleep that night. The moment she got home from her extravagant birthday party, still wearing the remnants of her makeup and heels kicked off at the door, she pulled the deed back out of her purse and stared at it under the dim glow of her kitchen light. Her hands trembled slightly as she reread the terms. That part about full ownership with conditional restrictions sent a chill down her spine. She didn't understand. Why would a gift have legal restrictions? The next morning, curiosity got the better of her. She called her lawyer, James, and asked him to look over the deed. James was sharp and blunt. "Avery didn't just give you a house," he said after reviewing the papers. "She gave you a statement. There's a clause here, Margaret. It prevents you from transferring ownership or selling the property for the next 15 years unless under extreme hardship. And here's the kicker. If you violate any part of the clause, ownership reverts back to the trust that Avery controls." Margaret was stunned. "So, she can take it back? Only if you break the conditions? Which," he added, "are extremely reasonable. But knowing you, they might be hard." Margaret didn't reply. The condition was simple. You must maintain a respectful and public relationship with the donor, as family. In plain words, she wasn't allowed to continue bad-mouthing Avery or excluding her from family events. It wasn't just a gift. It was accountability in the form of real estate. For the first time in her life, Margaret had to earn something by behaving with decency. Word about the house spread quickly. Relatives who once rolled their eyes at Avery now looked at her with fresh admiration. Some even apologized for believing what Margaret had said over the years. But that only made things worse for Margaret, who felt her carefully crafted image crumble by the day. Then something happened that Margaret hadn't anticipated. Ryan's younger sister, Claire, showed up at Avery's startup headquarters with a lunch basket and a very different attitude. "I used to think you were just pretending," Claire said, settling into the sleek lobby. "But now, I think you're the real deal." Avery gave a small smile. "I always was. People just chose not to see it." Claire leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You didn't hear it from me, but Mom's furious. She's been going around telling people you manipulated her with this trap house gift, that it was all some PR stunt." Avery blinked. Not with shock. She expected this. But what Claire said next hit harder. She also told Aunt Lydia she wished Ryan had married someone more suitable, someone with class. Avery's throat tightened. After everything, Margaret was still at it. But this time, Avery didn't stay silent. That weekend, the Monroe family had another event, a garden party for a cousin's engagement. Avery hadn't been invited, of course, but Ryan insisted they both show up anyway. They walked in together, Avery in a simple navy dress, hair pinned back neatly, no flashy jewelry. And yet, She turned every head, because what she carried with her wasn't wealth. It was respect. Earned, quiet, undeniable. Margaret's eyes widened when she saw her. A few guests gasped, but Ryan didn't stop walking until they were in front of everyone. He raised his glass and spoke clearly. "I just want to say how proud I am of my wife. She's been silent for too long. So today, I want to make sure this family finally knows who Avery really is. Not the girl you all whispered about behind her back, but the woman who built a business that helped thousands. The woman who gave my mother her dream home. And the woman who still chooses grace over revenge, even when she's been lied about for years." The air turned to glass. Margaret stood frozen, face tight, lips pressed so hard they lost their color. But she said nothing. That evening, as Avery walked through the rose-covered archway toward their car, an older man tapped her gently on the shoulder. It was Ryan's Uncle Bernard, quiet, rich, and rarely involved. "I looked into your company," he said. "I'd like to invest." Avery smiled politely. "Thank you, but I'm not taking outside investors right now," he chuckled. "Smart girl? You remind me of me, back when I had to prove myself to a room full of doubters." She glanced back at the party, then at him. It's funny how doubt always comes louder from those closest to you. What no one knew was that Avery had already started her next venture, one that would make everything that came before it look like a warm-up. And this time, she wasn't just building a business, she was building legacy. But Margaret wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. She had one final card to play, something from Avery's past, something she thought could destroy her credibility in an instant. All it took was one call to an old contact in Detroit, and suddenly, Avery's childhood came crawling back, or so Margaret thought. What she didn't realize was that Avery had already made peace with her past. What was coming next would be Margaret's real reckoning. Margaret thought she had found the perfect way to expose Avery. She dug into her background, found an old address in a rundown Detroit neighborhood, and with some help from a family friend with access to certain databases, she pulled a copy of Avery's juvenile record. It wasn't much, a shoplifting charge from when Avery was just 15. But to Margaret, it was gold. She printed it out and slipped it into her purse. At the next family gathering, held at Claire's new townhouse, Margaret waited for the perfect moment. Ryan had stepped outside for a call. Avery was helping Claire arrange drinks, and the room was filled with Monroe relatives. Margaret cleared her throat. "It's admirable," she began with mock sweetness. "How far someone can come, even with a criminal record." All heads turned. Avery slowly straightened from the drinks table, her expression unreadable. Claire froze. One of the cousins let out a sharp breath. Margaret pulled the folded paper from her purse and waved it like a flag. "I guess money can buy redemption." The silence was suffocating, but Avery didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She stepped forward, took the paper from Margaret's hand, glanced at it, then turned to the rest of the family. "I was 15. My mother had been laid off. My brother was sick. I stole diapers and baby formula. I got caught. I was sentenced to 40 hours of community service, and I never stole again." No one moved. "I built everything I have today not in spite of that moment, but because of it. Because I swore to myself that no one in my family would ever have to choose between survival and shame again." Claire's eyes welled up. Ryan, now back in the room, walked over and stood beside his wife. "And she told me this on our 3rd date. So if you think you're exposing her, Mom, you're only exposing yourself." Margaret's face turned crimson. But before she could open her mouth, Uncle Bernard, who had overheard everything, stood up. "I admire someone who learns from their mistakes. I despise someone who weaponizes them." He left without another word. One by one, others followed. Avery and Ryan stood quietly while Margaret stood alone in the middle of the room, holding a piece of paper that had lost all its power. Later that week, Margaret received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from Avery. It was from the trust lawyer who managed the property. It informed her that a violation of the deeds clause had been reviewed and confirmed. Her recent public slander, documented by multiple family members, triggered the clause's reversal process. In simple terms, she had broken the agreement. The house? Reclaimed, reassigned, no longer hers. She couldn't believe it. She stormed into the law office in a rage, only to be shown security footage from the party and signed witness statements. It was airtight. That night, Margaret cried for the first time in years, but not for the house, not even for the humiliation. She cried because the power she had spent a lifetime using, her influence, her control, her reputation, had evaporated the moment Avery stood up and refused to bow. The next few months passed quietly. Avery, in the meantime, launched a second startup. This one centered on supporting underprivileged teen entrepreneurs. Her story went viral. She was invited on talk shows, interviewed in national magazines, and awarded a Businesswoman of the Year honor. During one of the award galas, a reporter asked her how she dealt with critics, especially from within her own family. Avery gave a calm smile. "I used to think silence was strength. Now I know that strength is telling the truth, even when it shakes the ground beneath you." Back home, Margaret watched the interview from her small condo. The same woman she once called a gold digger was now being celebrated for lifting others out of the same poverty she had clawed her way out of. Then came the final twist, the one that no one saw coming. One cold December morning, Margaret's doorbell rang. She opened it to find a teenage girl standing there, shivering, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Are you Margaret Monroe?" the girl asked. "Yes," Margaret said, confused. "I'm your granddaughter. My mom is Avery's half-sister. She died last year. Avery, she tracked me down and said I might need help. She said you might have space." Margaret's knees almost gave out. Avery had sent her a child, not out of spite, not out of strategy, but out of kindness. Margaret opened the door wide, and for the first time in her life, she said something she had never said before. Not to Ryan, not to Avery, not even to her own husband when he was alive. She said, "Come in." Margaret never expected that the silence in her home could be filled with something more than bitterness. But ever since Lila, her 13-year-old granddaughter, moved in, the walls began to echo with something new, warmth. Lila was shy at first, hesitant, unsure how to treat the woman Avery had warned her about. But Margaret, to her own surprise, didn't push. She let Lila be. She made her hot chocolate. She cleaned out the spare room. She even offered to take her shopping, awkwardly asking what teenage girls wore these days. One evening, as they sat watching an old movie, Lila spoke up. "You're not what I expected." Margaret turned. "What did you expect?" Lila shrugged. "Someone mean. Someone who didn't like people like me, or Mom." Margaret swallowed hard. "I was that person, for a long time." Lila looked at her. "Why?" The question landed with more force than Margaret anticipated. She didn't have an easy answer. Maybe it was fear, maybe jealousy, maybe something uglier she didn't want to name. She didn't respond. But the next day, she did something she'd never done before. She drove to Avery's office. Avery wasn't expecting her. She was in a meeting. Margaret waited in the lobby for almost an hour. Finally, Avery stepped out, caught off guard to see her standing there. "I'm not here to fight," Margaret said. "I just wanted to say thank you. And I'm sorry. For everything." Avery nodded, her expression unreadable. As Margaret turned to go, Avery spoke. "You didn't have to take her in, but you did." "She's family," Margaret replied, without hesitation. Weeks passed. Slowly, Margaret began mending relationships, not just with Avery, but with others she had alienated over the years. She even showed up to Ryan's office one day with a homemade casserole, awkwardly handing it over like a peace offering. But just as things seemed to be healing, another storm hit. Lila went missing. One afternoon, she didn't come home from school. Margaret called Avery, panicked. Avery rushed over. Hours passed. No word. Police were called. Friends were questioned. Margaret sat on the couch, shaking, thinking this was punishment. For all the years she looked down on others, ignored their pain, dismissed their humanity. Just before midnight, they got a call. Lila had been found at a bus station. She had tried to run away, not from Margaret, but from school bullies who discovered who her mother was and mocked her for being the child of a deadbeat ex-con. When Margaret and Avery arrived to pick her up, Lila clung to Avery and whispered through tears, "I didn't want to make things harder for anyone." Margaret's heart broke all over again, not just for Lila, but for every child like her, cornered by the judgment of people like the woman Margaret had once been. That night, Avery stayed over. The three of them sat together in silence, occasionally breaking it with quiet talk, reassurances, and plans to change schools. Avery promised Lila that her worth was not tied to her past or her parents' mistakes. Margaret sat there, nodding, echoing every word. The next morning, Avery got up early and left a note on the kitchen table. "Thank you for being who she needed." Margaret read it 3 times. Something changed after that. Margaret became involved in Lila's school. She started attending Avery's community events. And one day, she stood in front of a packed room of young entrepreneurs and told her own story, not to preach, but to confess. She spoke about judgment, arrogance, and the pain of realizing too late that the people she once dismissed were the ones carrying the future on their shoulders. The video of her speech was uploaded to social media and unexpectedly went viral. Comments poured in, people recognizing themselves in her journey, others sharing how they'd treated others poorly out of fear or ignorance. Avery called her later that week. "You may have just done more good with that one speech than you ever did trying to protect your image," she said. Margaret laughed softly. "I stopped caring about my image the day Lila walked through my door. But then, just as things seemed finally settled, the final blow came. Margaret was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. She found herself forgetting simple things, appointments, names, sometimes what room she'd just walked into. At first, she tried to hide it, but Lila noticed. And then Avery did too. Instead of recoiling, they rallied around her. They set up routines, wrote notes, installed reminders. Lila learned how to cook simple meals. Avery rearranged her schedule to visit every week. One evening, as Margaret sat on the porch with Avery, she asked, "Do you think it's too late to be the kind of person I should have been?" Avery looked at her mother-in-law, not with resentment, but with the weight of everything they had survived. "You already are," she said. Margaret didn't cry often anymore, but that night, she did. And when she went to bed, she placed the old deed, the one for the house she had lost due to her own cruelty, in a drawer, and beside it, a photo of Lila smiling in the sunlight. It wasn't the house that mattered anymore. It never had been. Months passed. Margaret's condition progressed slower than expected, but the small slips became more frequent. Sometimes she forgot where she left her keys. Other times, she forgot she had already asked Lila the same question 3 times. But the biggest fear struck the morning she looked at Avery and, for a brief, terrifying moment, couldn't remember her name. Avery tried to stay composed, but Margaret saw the panic behind her daughter-in-law's eyes. Lila noticed too, going silent over breakfast, stirring her cereal without eating. That same evening, Margaret gathered them both in the living room and pulled out a folder. "I don't know how long I have before I forget more important things," she said, "but there's something I want you both to see." Inside the folder were documents, not for the house she currently lived in, but for another one, a newer one, in Avery's name. "I bought it a few weeks ago," she explained. "It's in your name, free and clear. It's closer to your office. Better schools for Lila. And you won't have to worry about me. I've also arranged for in-home care when the time comes." Avery was stunned. "Why would you do this?" Margaret looked at her with the clearest eyes she had shown in days. "Because I once tried to destroy your peace, and now I want to protect it. I won't be the reason you give up your life again." Lila rushed over and hugged her tightly, whispering that she didn't want anything to change, that she wanted to stay together. Margaret held her just as tightly, but another surprise came days later. Ryan showed up unannounced. He looked thinner, older. Life hadn't been kind to him. After his reckless marriage collapsed, he struggled financially. His investments failed. And now, hearing about Margaret's diagnosis, he finally reached out of guilt, out of fear, or perhaps for something more selfish. He sat at the kitchen table, looking across at Avery and Margaret. Lila watched from the doorway. "I know I don't deserve anything," Ryan said, "but I want to be part of Mom's care. I want to help." Avery didn't answer immediately. Years of betrayal don't wash away in a single sentence. But Margaret, to everyone's surprise, nodded. "I don't need your help with care," she said. "But maybe Lila needs to see what redemption looks like." And so Ryan started coming around. Not often, not as a father, but as someone trying to be human again. But the real shock came when Lila, inspired by her grandmother's journey, entered a national essay contest titled, "What Makes a Hero?" She wrote about Margaret, not the woman who judged her mother, but the woman who changed, who admitted her mistakes, who gave without expecting anything back. Her essay won. The story was published in newspapers. Avery's startup gained even more attention, flooded with requests for interviews, not just about business, but about healing, second chances, and family. One morning, Margaret opened the newspaper and saw a headline that read, "The Woman Who Bought Peace with Kindness." Beneath it was her photo, alongside Avery and Lila. She stared at it for a long time, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Then she whispered, "I remember." But a week later, she forgot what day it was. Then, a few days after that, she forgot who the president was. The decline was beginning. And yet, every time she forgot something, Lila was there to remind her. Gently, lovingly, without frustration. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret turned to Avery and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Avery replied, "You gave me every reason to, but you also gave me something else. Proof that even the hardest hearts can change." Lila came out holding a small photo album she'd made. On the first page was a picture of Margaret holding baby Lila. On the last page, a simple handwritten note. "You were never the villain, just someone who needed time to learn how to love." Margaret pressed the album to her chest and closed her eyes, the warmth of forgiveness wrapping around her tighter than any blanket. And in that moment, even if she forgot everything else, she remembered that she was finally enough. As Margaret sat there, surrounded by the love and warmth of the people she had once pushed away, she realized that the greatest gift wasn't the house, the success, or even the money. It was the chance to rewrite her story, to transform from the woman who once looked down on others into someone capable of healing and giving back. Sometimes life throws us curveballs. Sometimes we make mistakes that seem impossible to undo. But in the end, it's not about how we fall, it's about how we rise. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who might need a reminder that it's never too late to change, to love, and to find redemption. You never know who needs to hear that today.